Good afternoon. It says in the program that I'm a New Orleans musician and Katrina survivor. I'm very proud and happy to say that I am a New Orleans musician, but I can't honestly say that I'm a Katrina survivor because I don't know if I survived yet. It's not over. You know, I see history as being more important now than ever before. So much of what is going on in New Orleans today is related to things that have happened in the past in history, and it's amazing. They always say history repeats itself. It's amazing how much it does. I don't watch a lot of television, but I don't see television quite the same today. I try to keep the TV off because the news is pretty depressing to me. And if I happen to turn on a movie, the movies that used to give me pleasure don't anymore. I used to watch the Titanic. I said, well, at least not too many black folks drowned on there. But I turn it on now, and for some reason I see walls of water coming in on me, so I can't watch that anymore. Poseidon Adventure, can't watch that. I used to watch a lot of the old westerns and say, well, somebody else is suffering besides us. But I can't watch that anymore because I talked to some of the musicians I know and friends and people from New Orleans who got shipped out to Oklahoma and all these other places, and I said, that's just like the Indians. You know, and I talked to somebody a few weeks ago, and they said, how you doing? I'm still here waiting for the cavalry. Oh. You know, so much of what Dr. Rose said has been an integral part of my life in the last year and few months. So many things that I've seen and I see now, and it's amazing until you really live through and go through some things like what people in New Orleans are going through. It's hard to even believe. It's still hard for us to believe. New Orleans found out a long time ago the importance of the sense of community. When we see New Orleans culture, people talk about the Neville Brothers and Jazz Fest and the Marcelluses, and people go to Bourbon Street. Those are very, very small parts of what New Orleans really is about. New Orleans is a way of life, and even jazz, as great of a contribution as it is, widely considered America's only truly original contribution to the arts, as great as that is but a part of New Orleans culture and a part of a way of life that is very extensive in the African American community. We have, for example, people that are called Mardi Gras Indians. I didn't bring any pictures because I don't have time to show them. But look it up on the internet and you will see something that is fascinating. If it were not for Katrina, normally around this time of the year in some of the poorest neighborhoods in New Orleans, some of the toughest African American men would be spending their evenings, every evening, sewing costumes with beads and sequins and feathers, and spending sometimes thousands of dollars on an outfit that they're going to wear one day. But it's not about that one day. It's about the mindset of them converting a life of second-class citizenship, of poverty, into a life of nobility, a life of majesty, where they achieve a high status, and that sustains them for the rest of the year. So even working on the costume makes them forget about all of the other things that go on. And then when they get together, the music that they play sounds very much like West African music. And in fact, this is a street continuation of the kinds of African rhythms and chanting that was seen in Congo Square throughout much of the 19th century. We also have social aid and pleasure clubs and benevolent organizations that for many years were not just self-help groups, but provided a context for the heart and soul of New Orleans to demonstrate itself on the streets. These, as I mentioned in the earlier presentation, the social aid and pleasure clubs were the principal sponsors of jazz parades and jazz funerals. And those annual parades are parades that are given throughout what they call parade season. This has nothing to do with Mardi Gras. There are no floats and no beads and no throws or anything like that. It's just people in the black community in clubs, and they spend quite a lot of money on costumes and outfits. And they have brass bands, and they have a parade. And the parades they used to last about 6 to 8 hours. Now they last 4 hours. And they parade in black neighborhoods. And for much of the 20th century, they were almost hidden and unknown, even though they involved thousands of people. If you've ever been fortunate enough to see what they call nowadays a second-line parade, it's not like anything else anywhere else. Not Mardi Gras, not Macy's Thanksgiving Day, not Christmas parades. This is not where you come out and you look at it and say, oh, that's nice, and then you turn around and go home. In New Orleans, you have to become a part of the parade. You are hypnotized by the music. You drop what you're doing and you come along and you dance. 2 hours, 3 hours, or the whole parade route. You're doing creative dances that are a parallel to the creative music. And the music and dance inspire each other. And usually at the end of the parade, people come out of the trance and then they're mad because now they have to walk all the way back home. But they were dancing all the way down. Brass bands were traditionally 10-piece groups that brought traditional jazz music to the streets, and the brass bands also perform in jazz funerals. Jazz funerals are a very important part of New Orleans culture. The majority of jazz funerals were given for members of these social aid and pleasure clubs throughout most of the 20th century, and then the better-known jazz funerals are given for musicians, but those have become very commercial. People trying to get on television and stuff. But the jazz funeral is a very time-honored tradition. It gives you a double aspect of the experience of death. There is slow and sad music when going to the cemetery, which highlights the sadness of a person's dying, the sadness that we feel that they're gone. And then the second part of the ceremony has up-tempo music and joyous dancing, sending a person off right, sending them to a greater reward. They are now free of their earthly troubles and burdens, and they're gone to a better place, union with the Creator. So that is cause for joy, not sadness. So that's how we conclude the funeral. New Orleans is also many other aspects there are many other aspects of the New Orleans way of life. It's seen in different churches, but New Orleans life and philosophy is seen in food. Perfect example of that is gumbo, okay? Gumbo in New Orleans is as special as jazz. The best gumbo is not in anybody's restaurant, it's in black people's homes. And everybody's mama cooks the best gumbo. I know mine did. She did. I'm thinking about it right now. But where else can you take things that don't normally seem to go together? Chicken, shrimp, ham, oysters, hot sausage, smoked sausage, and God knows what else, and throw all of that together and come up with something incredible. And everybody has their own different way of doing it. That's the same philosophy that goes into the making of jazz, to use your own creativity and your own special touch to make something happen out of nothing. That is a philosophy of transformation that is very important. That's what happens with the Mardi Gras Indians. I brought a Mardi Gras Indian one time to one of my programs at Xavier University, and he was proud and majestic and talking about all the traditions and his rank, and I threw a wrench in it and said at the end, what do you do every day? And his whole demeanor changed. He kind of leaned in, he said, I'm a truck driver. But the thing is, he's a truck driver to support his Mardi Gras Indian habit, because that's what he really is. And through that rank, he became something noble and proud and majestic. So that helped to make life livable. There is a New Orleans way of dressing. People also because when you talk about jazz, it's not just the music, it's also the food, it's the language, it's the way people dress. It is common for people to dress in the most outrageous color combinations imaginable. In fact, many of the social aid and pleasure clubs pride themselves in wearing 4, 5, 6 different clashing versions of the same color. But even that is a statement and a philosophy about life, to transform one reality into another, to make it work. Somehow, when they all have that on, it does work. So those are bold statements that hint at social structure and social order and racism. It is a way of exalting the black ego and the black identity. Race and class were very important when we talk about what happened in the impact of Katrina. Before Katrina, there was urban regentrification going on. There was a lot going on in New Orleans. New Orleans was in a decrepit condition. I hate to say, I was born there all my life. Ancestors go back to before jazz started. But the problem is, we had, well, I guess you could say New Orleans was one of the #1 cities. Crime, poor education, drugs, auto theft, poverty, illiteracy, unemployment. We were near the top of all of those things. We had nearly 70% black population. We had black elected officials. But again, I mean, that's, you know, like Dr. Rose said, I mean, that's been a cover-up because the social condition of many people hasn't changed, not for the better, but it's gotten worse. And I would dare say if Alain Locke came along these days, I would like to talk to him about the black elected officials as being the new Negro. I think some of these officials are, well, I don't know if they're really, what I really think happened is, you know, when they had that thing about Area 51, the Martians, I think they came over and took over some people and turned them green, because a lot of the officials we have, they bleed green and they think green. Now, quite a lot happened in New Orleans. I don't have much time, but I'll say this much. The culture of Mardi Gras Indians, brass bands, social clubs, and jazz, the heart and soul of New Orleans was the community, and that sense of community has been ruptured. More than half of the citizens are not back in New Orleans, and despite what you see on NFL Day and the Saints, it's great that the Saints are playing and winning in the Superdome where so many tragedies happen. They paid quite a lot of money to fix the Superdome, but most of the city is still in ruins. Most of the neighborhoods, if you go down to the French Quarter and look around, it doesn't look bad, but that's not, go to Gentilly, go to the 9th Ward, go to Lakeview, go to some parts of uptown New Orleans, and you will see, go there at night, okay? I think we have more rats in the city today than people. I've caught in the last 2 weeks, I shouldn't tell you, I've caught about 14 in the last 2 weeks. And I live in a FEMA trailer. It is very difficult to understand what's happening in New Orleans. It leaves us, we have a lot of questions. Not only why did what happened happen, but why is it still happening? Why aren't people coming back to the city? Many people are not able to come back to the city. Jobs, housing, basic social services, all of that stuff is not ready. So that leaves us with a lot of things to discuss about race and class. And I wanted to say that the level of destruction of Katrina is tremendous. We lost a lot of people, we lost a lot of property, but for many of us, the tragedy of Katrina continues, okay, in the way of many people are suffering with social and physical illnesses, not social, psychological and physical illnesses. We're dealing with sick relatives. We're dealing with many people. I met a young man whose father died. Many of the victims of Katrina are still suffering and dying on us all the time. So it's not over for many of us. Many of us have a beautiful home sitting in Gentilly that is empty with a lot gone. The problem for New Orleans is, will the musicians come back? Will the people come back? The culture of New Orleans is the people. And without that, we're in a lot of trouble. One other level of the loss in New Orleans has been things like my own personal collection, which was a tremendous archive of African American cultural materials. There were many other people that lost similar kinds of things. Like Dr. Rose mentioned, there has been, for some reason, an interest in the music, but there's not as much of an interest in the people. I'll close with this. One of the problems in New Orleans today is that there are many people that are faking the idea of culture and jazz. So we have to be very careful about that. And there's a young man who came from England who's been playing jazz for about 45 years and made quite a lucrative living off of some of the older black jazz musicians. He had a house so big it looked like Noah's Ark. And he was appointed to a very important board, a policy-making body in New Orleans. And he told me one time after a meeting, they're talking about all this culture. I'm not worried about culture. I just came down here for the music. If I wanted culture, I would have stayed in England. So that gives you an idea. There are too many issues for us to talk about today. But keep praying for us. Many of us are optimistic. We're trying to get back. But I think I'll leave you with this. Remember that anything that anyone can do to help us rebuild New Orleans, you're helping yourselves, because it may happen to you.
Organizers and sponsors for putting this together. It's extremely important. Yeah. Now, I as an academic, 15 minutes is frightening as actually an amount of time, because you spend all your time coming up with all this cool information and you're just so happy to have people who kind of at least want to hear it, and then they give you 15 minutes. So I'm a New Yorker and I normally speak fast. It's about to go into high drive, so just hang on. Let me give you a sense of what I want to do first that will make the journey hopefully more intelligible. The first thing is that I want to honor the questions that Dr. Betty Garner opened this symposium with, the ones identified for this panel in particular. She wanted us to engage with this question of the impact of dislocation. You know, what has the impact of dislocation in black urban communities produced? What are the futures for black urban communities and identities? How does race and racism participate, occupy American life now? And what are the future of African Americans in the U.S.? And because we have such distinguished artists, creative people, and local people who are responding from the very cities and articulating life in those cities, I want to really lay out a large map, in a sense, of what's been going on, how to talk about and think about what's happened in black urban communities in the U.S. over the past 30 years or so, because a very distinctive shift took place that we don't necessarily articulate, and it's going to shape what is in front of us. So I'm going to try to lay things out at that level. The first thing I want to do is this notion of dislocation. There's no doubt that the recent tragedy in New Orleans makes us think more thoughtfully about the impact and more immediately about the impact of dislocation. It was many, many tragedies rolled into one, the hurricane itself being in many ways not the biggest part. But we must remember that there is no New World black presence without a series of constant dislocations. There is no black culture in Western society without, in any sustained way, without the transatlantic slave trade. And that is, of course, the crucible through which we need to understand this notion of dislocation. I don't have time to even begin to go into the depths of that, but I want to mark a handful of significant dislocations from then to now to help us see that dislocation is at once the hallmark of both crisis and opportunity in black culture, that it's these moments that have been both extraordinarily difficult, but the resiliency and the strategies and the creative response to these circumstances are part of what make black culture what it is. And so I want to mention them briefly so we can both be, on the one hand, thoughtful about the suffering, but also about the promise that each of these moments brought. Even under slavery, where after the Middle Passage in its repetitions, there were constant efforts to separate black communities, ethnic and tribal kinships were deliberately disconnected, and yet with emancipation, many African Americans walked hundreds of miles to find each other, to reconnect, to remain sustained, to try to create links in the face of those disconnections. Structural forms of constant dislocation were encouraged after emancipation. Jim Crow itself produced this, the Black Codes, a set of laws that produced the beginning of really hyper-incarceration of black people and another form, therefore, of dislocation. In the modern period, as we talked about much earlier this morning, the Great Black Migration was this extraordinary moment of, again, opportunity and crisis. The city, the so-called promised land, did not yield as much as anyone had hoped, but it absolutely did place African American life at the heart of cultural institutions and modern American consciousness. And this was absolutely central, but it was also a source of dislocation. Now, with the most recent period, say mid-1960s to the present, African American urban communities have been shaped by, primarily by, a series of policies that we can quickly dub urban renewal. Now, I and many of my colleagues have dubbed this Negro removal, because it has actually had as its primary hallmark the dislocation and deconstitution of black urban communities. Now, many of the crises that we think of when we imagine this thing we have both fantasized about and created called the ghetto is the product of lengthy policies that have their origins in periods prior to the Great Black Migration, really early part of the 20th century. But they take on a special shape and characteristic. So here I want us to look at continuity and discontinuity at the same time. The conditions that we see really taking hold in the mid-1970s forward, just unconscionable levels of homelessness, drug addiction unchecked and, in fact, according to many, encouraged and facilitated by police forces and the federal government. Drug and gang-related crimes, high levels, unbelievably high levels of unemployment, even greater than some of the numbers in some cities done during the Great Depression. You know, hard to believe that that could be going on. These are the result of a sustained assault on black community formation itself. Processes that are beyond race, deindustrialization, for example, where American economic systems move from producing goods in an industry primarily to now selling culture, which is, for the most part, what we do, and controlling other industries in other nations. That process hit the black community probably the hardest because they were the last ones in industrial jobs. This shouldn't be surprising. And so they were, of course, hardest hit, least seniority, first ones let go in communities where other work was unlikely to appear. And the service industry that replaces this deindustrialized economy has no benefits, very low wages. And it's in that context and that economic infrastructure that black communities in the 70s and 80s come into existence. We also have a post-civil rights political context in which, you know, we used to think that having black elected officials would be the panacea. There's an interview somewhere with Angela Davis where she says if someone had told her in 1968 that, you know, having a black person on the Supreme Court wouldn't be a good thing for black people, she would not have believed them, right? There was a sense that if you put black people in a particular place, it will yield a progressive black politics. This is no longer the case. We have black elected officials who are in many ways conspiring, not all, but many, conspiring with the very structural forces that have depleted and destroyed or tried to destroy black communities. The hypercriminalization of young people, especially of young black men, while this has always been an issue, the presumption that African American communities are somehow criminal in their sheer existence, the development of the prison industrial complex, a kind of industry of prison building as a response to crime, when in fact crime rates have actually been dropping over the past 15 years. But the elevation of sentences, the uneven articulation of those sentences cross-race is astonishing, and it warehouses well over a third, at one point or another, well over a third of young black men in black America. And this is an unbelievably destabilizing, dislocating factor. Grassroots activists and leaders are disabled by a variety of strategies. Creating communities of connection are very difficult under these circumstances. They have neutralized in many moments, not permanently, but worked to neutralize the ability of working class urban African Americans to secure meaningful resources. You know, this is one thing to do this under institutions of segregation and under institutions of legalized, explicit forms of racism. But we're in a new moment. We're in a moment in the post-civil rights era where the rhetoric does not articulate with the policies. So although we might have had, the governor of Mississippi, as Lonnie Berry talked about this morning, saying very explicit forms of racist things constantly, you won't have that today more often than not. I mean, you will have slips here and there. But by and large, you have a rhetoric of equal opportunity and meritocracy. And what's my favorite word for all of this? Colorblindness. Anytime you have a policy where going blind is a good thing, you should definitely start asking some questions about that. But these rhetorics of these sort of post-civil rights racism are hiding, they're masking the history and the existence of structural racism, which again really impairs the black community in significant ways. Housing discrimination is not a random process. Those who study it carefully will tell you that this is a sustained process of not only creating limited resources and a lack of capital value for black property, but even on a more general level, it forces overcrowding and higher prices for the same resources. So there's a tax, a racialized tax in the housing market that is rather extreme, and it crosses class. It is, of course, most devastating for the poor, but it is cross-class. Go ahead, you can read Patricia Williams's book on Seeing a Colorblind Future, and she talks about her own experience with mortgages and how when she applied for the mortgage over the phone, she got this fabulous interest rate. When she went in to sign the papers, she then got a letter saying that there were new risks associated with her home ownership policy. And the only thing that changed was she showed up with brown skin. And they basically said, it's not race, it's just personally, it's just that this racial characteristic makes you a higher risk. Just straight out. So this cross-class form of housing discrimination is very important. Environmental racism, police harassment, sustained segregation, and what sociologists call disaccumulation. We talk a lot about accumulation of privilege, and we think clearly about, for example, how forms of the investment in whiteness produces unearned privilege. But what we don't often think about is that African American communities don't remain at the same level as this accumulation happens. Their communities are disaccumulated. Resources are taken away from those communities. And this process of disaccumulation, again, is accumulative. And so in these contexts where you have neighborhoods that have little value, at least in level of economics, and very difficult circumstances, African Americans have found a way to increase the value of their neighborhoods. And of course, we have people working on the ground to increase the actual economic value of neighborhoods, but we also have this other form of increased value. And the first is by turning segregation and disaccumulation into congregation and social appreciation. And this has been an unbelievably powerful strategy, turning segregation into congregation. And an intense attachment to place and as a mechanism of solidarity. And this context of creating what Mindy Fullilove calls emotional ecosystems help counter what she also calls the root shock of dislocation that many of these structural conditions produce. And the critical source for sustaining and nurturing emotional ecosystems and congregation is black creativity. And so we can't underestimate and separate black creativity from these circumstances. We live in a moment where it's very easy and understandable to celebrate individuals, and we've been asked to look at individuals as individuals. Who am I to say that we're not individually blessed? But we are part of communities. Humans are community-oriented beings. We survive in community. And so the resource-poor communities are network-rich communities. They rely on one another and create creative expressions as a source, not simply of random expression, but of life-sustaining force. So the beautiful, extraordinary dances that every generation comes up with, and whatever I was doing, nobody's doing anymore, I can guarantee you that. It's kind of tragic, but it happens to everybody. You bust out with a dance, and you swear it's hit, and you realize, in fact, it's 10 years old. But it's the last one you mastered, so it's the one you're gonna do. The music itself in all of its genres and forms, poetry, as we heard here today, which has also now developed a whole new wing of really spoken word artistry, which is an entirely different form. To hear it, to see it on the page is to not hear it at all, really, until you see it live. The extraordinary hairstyles that sisters have come up with, brothers too, but I think sisters probably have that one on lockdown. Fashion, the unbelievable sense of fashion and the ability to turn the absence of style, the desire to turn black people into institutional beings into creativity. Quick example. Everybody talks about sagging and oversized clothes and these clothes that don't fit. Oh my God, you are making that up. I got 2 minutes. Lord have mercy. Okay, so the example is, think about these oversized clothes. They really originate in the prison industrial complex. Young black men being incarcerated so young that the prison clothes don't fit them, and so they've got to wander around with clothes that are too big, but they don't want to look country, so they make it so cool that Macy's is selling XXX. So black creativity creates and nurtures sources of connection, of bonds, of pleasure, but it also reflects conditions and aspirations. And so it's in creativity that we can turn segregation into congregation. Institutionally speaking, the public sphere, as I started out, has been deeply impoverished. We have to realize that places for creative expression are virtually non-existent. Since urban renewal, which destroyed already fragile black communities, creating the kind of bombed out images that we have from the 70s that people are constantly trying to repair, 1,600 local jazz clubs were razed. Okay, the places for local community performance, talent shows, and everyday life were taken apart, and they were not replaced very easily. A few have been so, but in many cases, corporate institutions reselling black culture to tourists have replaced local black venues. The music programs in public schools have been dramatically cut since the 1970s, making formal education for those without extra resources for private teachers almost impossible. The corporate infiltration of black culture is actually at an extraordinary high. And if I had more time, I would talk about how much of what was originally quite extraordinary about hip-hop has been deeply manipulated in the marketplace. And what we get back now is something in the commercial venue that's quite disturbing. The rhetorics of new post-civil rights racism is no longer something direct and clear. It's indirect, hidden speech with indirect actions, but they have direct consequences. We no longer think about racism and structural racism. We think about now black people in dominant society as the problem themselves. So rather than removing the problems, we actually just rather remove the people. But not too far, because we also benefit so dramatically from black culture as a product that we want the culture without the people. And this is, again, a long-standing process that's deeply insulting. Thank you. And so, we have to really think carefully about how we want to defend. I don't have the time. I had 3 more pages. I'm going to tell you the conclusion now because I know my time is up. It's very important when we think about African American culture now that we think about these new conditions, that the irony of segregation was that it allowed black institutions to remain black, not so much in that they were racially segregated happily, but that they were able to promote the notion of saving black humanity and preparing and caring for and nurturing black people. With integration, the possibilities were hopeful, but the reality is that we have segregation without a name. Right? But we don't have the institutional mechanisms or the rhetorical mechanisms to actually support and nurture. So I want to make an argument for a multiracial black institution building. And by that I mean everyone needs to be involved in saving black communities if we're serious, even if you're just serious about black music. Right? And that means New Orleans. That means saving New Orleans for black people who live there. There's nothing wrong with a 70% black community. I don't understand the problem. This also means seeing ourselves as part of a global Black diaspora. African American communities are multinational now in ways unprecedented. Since 1965, new immigration laws changed that. Puerto Ricans, Cubans, Dominicans, Africans are part of African American society here now, and we need to see ourselves in connection to this. We need to demand that Black institutions be progressive, not just Black. We need to demand that Black humanity and dignity be at the heart of our celebrations. But most importantly, we need to remember, and this is really my last point, that we need to understand what made chitlins delicious. Now, this is very important, so if you'll just indulge me for 1 minute. We often confuse why chitlins are delicious. We think that they're just delicious. Really, they're not. They're made delicious by this enormous energy and spirit to take that which should in fact be thrown out and make it desirable, make other people want it. Black folks have figured out how to make white folks want to celebrate the ghetto. This capacity to make what is almost nothing, not just what's left over, but what's deliberately destroyed, venerable and desirable, is an extraordinary talent that we must cherish. But we must never celebrate chitlins fully, right? Because chitlins are a double-edged sword. Chitlins are that joy, that capacity, that talent, that amazing creativity, and it is the proof of deep degradation and structural racism. And so we have to enjoy the spirit of chitlins and leave the pig guts in the pig. Thank you very much.
That was a surprise. Today would have been my grandmother's 116th birthday. When they asked me to do a program on November 18th, I said, I have to do it. It's my grandmother's birthday and was my aunt's birthday. I'm a bicultural African American. No, not in the sense of that most African Americans are bicultural, being able to function both in the African American world and in the majority society of work and shopping. We grew up learning that the United States is a part of the dominant English-speaking world because we were a British colony. Our history begins with the 13 British colonies. Our references were to the British Crown, the Boston Tea Party, a protest to British taxation, the Revolutionary War fought against the Redcoats, and in today's world, concerns about the Commonwealth. I was introduced to the French-speaking world and its perspective at a young age, and it continues to be one of my vantage points. I see Louisiana through its French cultural lens, Africans brought from the French zones of influence, Senegal, Haiti, and Mauritania. Bambara people from Mali and Native Americans launched their first revolt against the French in Louisiana in 1729. I know the links France had with Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia before US intervention. Lebanon was French and sent its sons to safety in Senegal during its civil war in the 70s. St. Louis was settled by the French, who brought Haitian slaves there as its first Black residents. Haitian nuns fleeing their revolution came to New Orleans and settled in Baltimore. I follow French corporations and French foreign policies in their former colonies. My specialty is the French-speaking world and its interconnectedness. I was first introduced to the French perspective of the world in Brooklyn, New York, in 4th grade at PS 193 by a teacher who introduced us to the French language through public television instruction with puppets. That introduction proved very useful since my 5th grade French class in Cambridge, England was serious. Mastering French had much more immediacy in Britain, as I was to find out over our first holidays. Dad announced that we were going somewhere where they would not have Christmas because the religion was Islam, and told me about the 5 tenets of Islam. In Morocco, I would use that French with the other children and get around with my parents in Casablanca, Marrakesh, and Rabat. In late 1962, we stopped in Paris on the way back. We saw the sights, visited the Louvre, went to Montmartre and Notre Dame. While we met Black Americans in Britain and Morocco, we did not meet any in Paris, nor do I recall seeing any Black people. I returned to France the summers of my sophomore and senior years in high school, initially as part of an exchange program between Hartford, Connecticut, and the French town of Compiègne, where the armistice of World War I was signed. I lived with the Loison family, a nice middle-class French family. Georges, the father, was a chemist at the Biscuiterie Nantaise Cookie Company, and Blanche, the mother, was a secretary to a businessman. They lived with her mother and their 4 children, a girl, Veronique, and 3 boys. Raphael, who was my age, and his 2 brothers, Stéphane and Frédéric, helped me with my French. While watching television at dinner one evening, we saw the federal troops guarding U.S. cities that had erupted in riots that summer of 1967. That prompted a series of discussions about race in the United States and conflicts that had involved France, with Germany, and eventually with Algeria. These conversations helped me attain early fluency in French. The family had exchanges with Americans and Germans on alternate years. The exchange with Germans was to assure that their children would never go to war with Germany again. The family said that no racism existed in France, so I asked if they knew any Black people. They invited one of Raphael's teachers from Cameroon to spend an evening with us. He explained how he was refused employment and housing when he turned out to be a Black applicant. One weekend excursion, I met another French family that had recently returned from years in Algeria, bitter that they had lost their land and business following Algeria's war for independence. Blanche said I could even marry their daughter. I said, what if she wanted to marry a North African? She exploded, no. They are dirty and lazy. I said, there it is. That's racism. I got to know Paris well those summers. My fondest memory is sitting with the late historian Rayford Logan, who you saw this morning in the presentation, at a Paris cafe. He had just visited the battlefields where he had fought in World War I as an African American under French command and reminisced about Paris in the 1920s. Those summers when I saw Black people, I stopped them and asked why they had left Africa and the Caribbean and come to live in Paris. Most had come for school and for work. The education system in the French colonies and overseas territories ended for the most part with lycée, or high school, so that higher education had to be obtained in France or elsewhere. The education system that had brought future anti-colonial leaders Leopold Senghor and Ho Chi Minh to Paris in the 1920s and 1930s taught the same curriculum in all of the French-speaking world, whether Vietnam, Lebanon, Martinique, Mauritius, Morocco, or Mali. It was in France that these students learned that they were not really French. They missed home and began to write about where they'd come from, thus developing the literature of negritude that you heard about earlier in the presentation. My study also shifted from their experience in Europe to their countries of origin and regions of origin. As an undergraduate, I studied the conflict between the taught French culture and the experience, culture, and knowledge of African and Caribbean peoples. I spent a summer seminar in Martinique studying with authors Aimé Césaire and Edouard Glissant. I traveled to Côte d'Ivoire and Senegal only to be treated as an immigrant in France on my return. Your papers, please. No, you. Go to the immigrant line. Oh, so you're an American. Welcome to our country. How long will you be staying? My parents moved and the Loison family moved. I last saw Raphael in 1973 when he visited me in Chicago. We then lost contact with each other. I stopped traveling to Europe and moved to Senegal for 8 years. I returned to France in the late 80s after I began working for the Smithsonian. Paris looked completely different from the 60s and 70s. Cheap airfares made travel more accessible than the earlier days when travel was by ship. All kinds of people of color were visible in all parts of Paris. Middle Eastern, Asian, African. In late 2001, Raphael found me. He had seen my father on French television and decided to Google me. He found me on the board of the Reginald Lewis Museum of Maryland African American History and Culture in Baltimore and emailed me. I phoned him that day, and to my surprise, he is webmaster at the French Ministry of Culture, and I work in our equivalent, the Smithsonian. My work in Mali took me through Paris since 9/11 had finished off Air Afrique, Swiss Air, and Sabena. To and from Bamako, we would meet at the airport to catch up on the 29 years that had passed since we had last seen each other. His father had passed, and my mother had passed. We were both married to African American women. Him in 1985 and me in 1991. Raphael's wife is a gospel and jazz singer and playwright working in Paris. One of his brothers had also married an African-American woman, and there are Afro-French grandchildren in the Loison family. Blanche is so happy that I've kept up with my French. There is still a community of African-American expatriates living in Paris, of students, artists, musicians, singers, and business people. A few years ago, I met a young African-American author, Monique Wells, who woke up on a winter morning in Paris with a taste for grits. She broke into tears because she did not know where to start looking for them. Her search for ingredients for meals from home took her to Asian markets for greens and fish, to African markets for sweet potatoes, and American specialty stores for grits, cornmeal, and seasonings. She has compiled that research into a cookbook called Food for the Soul. France has changed fundamentally. It has become a multiracial and multicultural society. The image of the French woman is no longer the Marianne of Catherine Deneuve. She was displayed last year as representing a range of women, including women of color. A new generation of young people born to African and Arab parents has been educated in France, but they are ostracized and alienated by the color of their skin. They may be qualified for jobs on paper, but their color and foreign names disqualify them from employment. Their frustration level reached new heights at this time last year, and riots erupted across France. Immigrants have died trying to walk across the Sahara and cross the Straits of Gibraltar to reach Europe from Africa. Immigrants have also died in Paris from fires and overcrowded apartments with neither sprinkler systems nor escape routes. So I called my French brother Raphael to talk about the riots in his country. We spoke about how people from Martinique, Guadeloupe, and French Guiana were citizens but still faced discrimination. We spoke of how our conversations from the 60s had now come full circle. We compared our understanding of racism then with the issues confronting Paris of the 21st century. It will take an increased awareness by all French people to improve the situation of these youth of color, not only to be able to aspire to better lives, but actually attain the respect and opportunities they deserve as young French citizens. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Yes, I'm delighted to be with you today, and our ambassador was supposed to come, but he couldn't be with us, and he deeply regrets not being able to share these moments with you. And we had yesterday a small celebration at his residence, celebrating the 100th anniversary of Josephine Baker, and I think this is a very good opportunity for launching this symposium, and I hope to launch more programs between France and the African American community. And I hope that we might use the name of Josephine Baker for this initiative, and that we can call it the Josephine Baker Initiative in the future. And Indeed, there are many, many more things which have to be even studied, I'm sure, and we have so many documents. Just to give you a simple idea, 2 years ago, we have screened at the embassy 6 hours of performances in Paris with American jazzmen, Duke Ellington, and many others. And these were beautiful and treasures that had never been shown. They were coming from the French television archives. And so we have so many, many things that we can explore, and I hope that we'll start more and more things together. But I would like to read for you just a few lines of the speech that the ambassador has delivered yesterday. And he said, "The African-American presence in France is an important phenomenon which goes back to the earliest days of the United States existence. But the movement really gained in importance during World War I, and the arrival of large numbers of African-American soldiers. France will never forget what these heroes have done in order to save us. What the African-American community discovered in France was a model of integration which, in spite of many difficulties, and as you said earlier, was at that time way ahead of what was happening in the United States itself. Certainly, the situation has evolved a lot since that time, but the friendship of the African-American community for France has remained invaluable to us." And he said that musicians like Sidney Bechet, Duke Ellington, the Golden Gate Quartet, Coleman Hawkins, writers like Richard Wright, James Baldwin, and Chester Himes, painters like Lois Mailou Jones, have been in Paris, and these true intellectuals are part of our shared legacy, and the works they have produced have been an equal source of inspiration to both our nations. What we have learned from these outstanding individuals is priceless. And I think this is really true, and there is a fascination in both directions, I think. So thank you very much for inviting us to be part of this project.
One of the things you learn at the Humanities Council is how to wing it. Micheal, at some point, will be back up here, and what we'll do while we, in the interim, I know there are some questions, and just one thing I have to say, this is a wonderful panel. Many of the panelists, and I'll say this, have books and CDs for sale, and they, in many cases, would like you to, one, learn from them and to purchase them. So I would encourage you, there is a bookstore on the way out. We would encourage you to take a look at it, because I think if you heard the wisdom and knowledge that many of these people presented today, I think they have a lot to say. One of the things you see in the real world is things happen. And one of the things you learn, and I think African Americans and other people in the society have learned it well, you're resilient, you keep on moving, and we'll celebrate when the documentary comes out. I want to thank...
Sorry.
I want to say, being on the Humanities Council, and I call it, I don't, people give you titles, it's been a wonderful experience for me, because I think what you saw for last night and today was the opportunity for the village to give voice to itself, and to think about many of the issues that are important, not just in this room, but important in life and in the world. My voice is going. I want to thank everybody for coming. You are the most important person. I hope you tell people about this. You stay with it. You buy the books. You buy the CDs. And I want to say, I'm from Baltimore originally, so I want to thank all the people from Coppin who came over here and spent their day with us as an important thing. And I want to thank everybody from around the world who came. Have a safe trip home. Thanks a lot.
you.